some places do not fall slowly into ruin. They vanish. Without alarms. Without witnesses. Without records that explain why. On a remote island off the Irish coast, an entire town once lived between the sea and the wind. Then, one day, it was simply gone. In the early 19th century, off the western coast of Ireland, a small island settlement existed beyond regular shipping routes and official attention. It was home to families, fishermen, and stone houses shaped by Atlantic storms. No formal evacuation was ever recorded. No confirmed disaster was written into national archives. In the early 1800s, the western edge of Ireland was defined by distance, uncertainty, and a quiet separation from the rest of the country. Numerous small islands lay scattered along the Atlantic coast, many of them inhabited by communities that existed beyond the reach of regular administration or detailed record-keeping. The island at the center of this story was one of them. It sat several miles offshore, exposed to the open ocean, reachable only by small boats that depended entirely on weather and tide. The town on the island was modest in size but firmly established. Stone cottages were built close together to withstand strong winds, their walls reinforced with local rock gathered from the shoreline. Narrow footpaths connected the homes to storage sheds, drying racks for fishing nets, and a small stone chapel that served as the spiritual center of the settlement. There were no formal roads, no constructed harbor, and no protective sea wall, only a naturally curved inlet that offered limited shelter for boats during calmer conditions. Life on the island followed strict routines shaped by the sea. Most residents depended on fishing, seasonal kelp harvesting, and small-scale farming carried out on thin soil enriched with seaweed. Potatoes formed the core of the local diet, while livestock was scarce and carefully maintained. Trade with the mainland occurred irregularly and could be interrupted for weeks by storms or rough seas. As a result, the islanders relied heavily on self-sufficiency and shared labor. The early 19th century was a fragile period for isolated communities in Ireland. Economic pressure, limited land access, and political distance from central authority made survival increasingly difficult for those living far from major towns. Official census records were incomplete, and many events in such places were preserved only through parish memory or oral tradition. Births, deaths, and departures were often never formally recorded. Despite these challenges, the island town endured. Generations were raised there, and knowledge of the sea was passed down within families. However, subtle warning signs began to appear. Coastal erosion gradually narrowed usable land, storms became more destructive, and several houses closest to the cliffs were abandoned over time. Graves were reportedly moved further inland, suggesting a growing awareness of environmental risk. Even so, no formal decision to abandon the island was ever documented, and life continued without any recorded indication of the sudden disappearance that was to follow. In the decades that followed the town's quiet stability, signs of strain became increasingly difficult to ignore. Maritime conditions along the Atlantic coast grew harsher, and seasonal patterns that islanders relied upon became less predictable. Fishing yields declined in some years, forcing families to travel farther from shore, while storms arrived earlier and lingered longer than remembered by older residents. Contact with the mainland also began to change. Traders who once visited several times a year arrived less frequently, and some routes were abandoned entirely as ports shifted toward larger, safer harbors. Letters sent from the island went unanswered for long periods, not because of hostility, but because the island itself slipped from regular schedules. Supply shortages became common, and repairs that once took days began to stretch into months. Oral accounts suggest that discussions about leaving the island emerged during this period. These conversations were not urgent, nor were they unified, but they reflected a growing uncertainty about the future. Some families considered relocating to coastal villages on the mainland, while others believed the island could endure as it always had. No collective decision was reached, and daily routines continued. Weather records from nearby coastal stations indicate several unusually violent storms during the early 19th century. High winds damaged structures along the shore, and waves reached elevations rarely documented before that time. On the island, erosion accelerated, and sections of land that had once supported homes and storage sheds collapsed into the sea. A few buildings were dismantled deliberately, their stone reused further inland. When visitors eventually returned after a prolonged absence, the change was immediately apparent. Boats were no longer secured in the inlet, and familiar signals went unanswered. Houses stood closed or partially damaged, yet many interiors appeared undisturbed. Tools, household items, and fishing equipment remained where they had last been used. What troubled observers most was the lack of clear evidence explaining the town's fate. There were no signs of violence, no large debris fields, and no records of a mass relocation. The absence itself became the defining feature of the story, leaving later generations to reconstruct events from silence rather than testimony. No official explanation followed, and the island's disappearance gradually hardened into an unresolved historical question for historians. The defining moment in the history of the island town is marked not by a recorded catastrophe, but by the sudden realization that the settlement had stopped responding to the outside world. At some point in the early 19th century, the island passed from being isolated to being entirely silent. This transition did not appear dramatic at first, but its implications became clear only after time had passed. A vessel approaching the island after an extended absence provided the first clear indication that something was wrong. From the sea, the familiar outline of stone cottages was still visible, and the chapel remained standing, but there were no signs of activity. No boats were anchored in the inlet, and no figures appeared along the shoreline. Signals that were customarily answered went unnoticed, and smoke no longer rose from the chimneys, even during colder months. When landing parties eventually went ashore, they encountered an unsettling stillness. The paths between houses were empty, and doors were either closed or hanging open, moved only by the wind. Inside several cottages, personal belongings remained in place. Cooking vessels sat unused, tools rested where they had last been set down, and clothing was left behind. These details suggested that the town had not been abandoned gradually over many seasons, but neither did they point clearly to panic or violence. One of the most puzzling aspects was the absence of boats. They had not been damaged or left to rot along the shore. They were simply gone. This implied that at least some of the population had departed by sea, yet no coordinated arrival of island families was recorded on the mainland. Nearby coastal communities showed no sudden increase in population, and parish records from the period contain no mention of a large group seeking refuge or resettlement. Environmental explanations were considered. A powerful storm surge could have struck while residents were gathered near the shoreline, or gradual erosion may have made the island unsafe more quickly than expected. Disease was also proposed, as epidemics sometimes caused communities to flee without formal documentation. However, none of these theories could be confirmed through physical evidence or written sources. As weeks turned into months, the absence hardened into fact. The island remained uninhabited, and no effort was made to reclaim or repopulate the town. Without witnesses or records, the moment of disappearance itself was lost, leaving only the aftermath. The climax of the story, therefore, is not a single event, but the irreversible crossing from presence into absence, when the town ceased to exist as a living place and became only a location on a fading map. By the middle of the 19th century, the island no longer appeared in official descriptions as a place where people lived. It was described only as a geographic feature, a point of land surrounded by dangerous waters, useful to sailors only as a warning. The town that once occupied its sheltered inlet was no longer mentioned by name. In many records, it was not mentioned at all. The physical remains of the settlement persisted for some time. Stone walls stood without roofs. Paths were still visible between collapsed cottages. The chapel remained upright longer than most buildings, its structure resistant to wind even as its interior decayed. Visitors who reached the island in later decades described a sense of abandonment that felt complete rather than recent. There were no signs of return, repair, or remembrance. Nature continued its slow work. Grass spread across former fields. Sea spray and rain weakened mortar and stone. Erosion advanced along the cliffs, carrying parts of the settlement into the ocean. What had once been the center of daily life became increasingly difficult to distinguish from the surrounding landscape. The island did not preserve the town as a ruin. It absorbed it. Memory faded at the same pace. Mainland communities that had once traded with the island adjusted to its absence. Fishing routes changed. Names disappeared from conversation. Stories that survived became uncertain and fragmented, passed down without detail or agreement. Some recalled a storm. Others spoke of sickness. Many admitted they no longer knew what had happened, only that the island had once been inhabited. Official silence reinforced the disappearance. No inquiry was launched. No investigation was recorded. The absence of bodies meant there was no tragedy to document, and the absence of survivors meant there were no witnesses to question. Without a clear event, the disappearance resisted classification. It did not become a disaster, an evacuation, or a migration. It became a gap. Over time, maps were redrawn. Earlier editions that marked the settlement were replaced with simplified versions that showed only rock and shoreline. Navigational notes warned of rough seas but made no reference to human presence. To those who studied the charts later, the island appeared empty by nature, as if no town had ever existed there at all. What remains today is difficult to interpret without prior knowledge. A visitor might see scattered stones and assume they were natural formations. A low wall might appear to be part of the terrain. Without context, the signs of habitation lose their meaning. The island does not announce what it has lost. The people who live there left no final record. Their departure, whether deliberate or forced, did not enter the written history of the region. Their lives did not end in a known moment. They simply slipped out of documentation, leaving behind structures that outlasted memory but not time. The island continues to exist in silence. Waves break against its cliffs as they always have. Birds nest where roofs once stood. Wind moves through spaces that were once enclosed by walls. The town is no longer present as a community, a location, or a story with a clear ending. It exists only as absence. If this story mattered to you, consider subscribing. More forgotten history is coming.